Welcome back to Air Quality Matters and One Take. One Take, my take on a paper or report on air quality, ventilation and the built environment. One Take in that it's, well, in one take and tries to summarise for you the scientific perspective on something interesting in, well, usually 10 minutes or less, because who has the time to read all these amazing documents, right? This week, I'm looking at a real cornerstone document in our field. It's one of those reports that, even though it's getting on a bit, it really sets the stage for some of the conversations we have today around damp and mould and health. I'm talking about the 2004, so it really is quite old at this stage, Institute of Medicine report, simply titled Damp Indoor Spaces and Health. Now, you might be thinking, 2004, that's ancient history in scientific terms. And in some ways, you're right. But this wasn't just any paper. This was a massive, comprehensive review commissioned by the CDC in the United States, and it came at a time when public and scientific concern about mould was hitting real fever pitch. The backdrop, and a big part of the why for this report, was a cluster of tragic cases of acute pulmonary hemorrhage. That's severe bleeding in the lungs in infants in Cleveland, Ohio in the 1990s. Early investigations had pointed a finger at the link between these cases and homes with significant water damage and the presence of mould. So the Institute of Medicine was tasked with doing a deep, sober and comprehensive review of the entire body of scientific literature. They were asked to sort fact from fiction, association from causation, and to figure out what we actually knew. And what they produced was, I think, a landmark effort that still shapes our thinking today in a lot of ways, for good or bad. So what did they actually do? Well, the committee's approach was first and foremost systematic. They looked at the whole causal chain. They started with the building itself. How do buildings get wet in the first place? They looked at rainwater, plumbing, condensation, ventilation, all of the usual suspects. Then they looked at what happens when buildings get damp. And this is the key point they make right at the start. Dampness isn't a single, easily defined thing. It's a whole spectrum of conditions, from high relative humidity and condensation all the way to visible water damage and flooding. And this dampness, they explained, creates an environment. It's a habitat not just for fungi we call mould, but also bacteria for house dust mites, and it can even cause chemical emissions from building materials as they start to break down. So once you have this habitat, you get exposure. People breathe in spores, fungal fragments, bacterial toxins, and this whole complex soup of stuff. And that, of course, leads to the final question: what are the health outcomes? To answer this, the committee created a really clear framework for weighing the evidence. And I think this is one of the most valuable parts of the report. They used several categories to describe how confident they were in a link between an exposure and a health problem. It ranged from inadequate or insufficient evidence, basically we just don't know, all the way up to sufficient evidence and causal relationships, which is the gold standard, meaning the evidence is strong enough to say that this exposure can cause this outcome. And in between, they had limited or suggestive evidence and, importantly, sufficient evidence for an association. Now, an association is not the same as causation. An association just means that where you find one thing, you constantly find another. And we can be pretty confident it's not just down to chance or bias. We see this a lot, particularly in mold problems. It's a very strong hint, but it's not quite proof of cause and effect. And it turns out this distinction is absolutely crucial. So what did they actually find after reviewing the evidence that was in front of them at the time? Let's start at the top. The committee found sufficient evidence of an association, that strong, consistent link between living in a damp indoor environment and a specific list of health problems. These were upper respiratory tract symptoms, those nose and throat irritations we talk about, cough, wheeze, and asthma symptoms in people who are already sensitized asthmatics. They found the exact same strong association for the presence of visible mold and those symptoms, with the addition of a couple of other symptoms as well. This was huge. It was the scientific community, after a massive review, stating clearly, yes, there is a consistent, reliable link between these damp environments and these very common respiratory symptoms. It validated the experience of many people. Okay, so what about the next level down, the limited or suggested evidence? Here, things get a bit more nuanced. They found suggested evidence linking damp indoor environments to dyspnea and shortness of breath and to lower respiratory illnesses in otherwise healthy children. And perhaps more interestingly, they found limited or suggestive evidence for an association with the development of asthma. That's not just making existing asthma worse, but potentially being a factor in someone getting asthma in the first place. The evidence wasn't rock solid, but it was pointing in a direction that demanded more investigation. But then we get to the inadequate or insufficient evidence category. This is the we don't really know list, and it's a long one. It includes things like fatigue, skin symptoms, and neuropsychiatric problems. But the real kicker is what else is on that list. Remember those tragic infant pulmonary hemorrhage cases in Cleveland that prompted the whole investigation? The committee concluded that, based on the available scientific literature in 2004, there was inadequate or insufficient information to determine whether an associative link between acute idiopathic pulmonary hemorrhage in infants and the presence of the mold or damp. Now, that's a really important finding. It doesn't mean a link doesn't exist. It means the scientific proof, the rigorous evidence required to establish that link, just wasn't there at the time. The case reports were there, but the broader, more controlled evidence was lacking. And this really gets to the heart of the problem that the report identifies so clearly. The challenge of exposure assessment. It's not as simple as measuring one thing in the air. People in damp buildings are exposed to a complex soup of fungal spores, bacteria fragments, mycotoxins, volatile organic compounds, mold, volatile organic compounds, and more. And the report makes it clear that we're, and frankly still are, not great at measuring this exposure in a way that can be definitively linked to a specific health outcome. Our tools were, and often still are, too crude. So what's the one take from this massive report? For me, it's this. The 2004 report established with scientific rigour that dampness in buildings is a public health problem because of its strong and consistent association with respiratory symptoms. Full stop. It provided the solid scientific foundation for taking these issues seriously. At the same time, it laid bare the huge challenges and gaps in our knowledge. It highlighted the critical need for a clear, standardised definition of dampness and shone a massive spotlight on the black hole that is exposure assessment. And if you think about some of the things we've been talking about in the last few weeks, not a lot has moved on. It couldn't give us all the answers, especially on the most frightening potential outcomes. But it did something just as important. It drew a clear map of what we knew and what we thought we knew and what we desperately needed to find out. It essentially gave us a scientific mandate to say, yes, this matters, even if it couldn't tell us exactly how and why in every case. And that in itself was a huge step forward, and why, even 2 decades on, it's a document worth revisiting. Thanks a million for listening to this week's episode of One Take. These podcasts aren't possible without our sponsors, Safe Traces and Imbiot, so thanks a million to them. See you again next week.